Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Bonema. I'm one of the pastors of Unity Presbyterian Church, and I want to welcome you to our Starting Points workshop. We have just concluded a 5-week series titled Walking in Their Shoes. If you were a part of that series, you know that's why we have all of these shoes on the wall here, is because we were encouraging you to put yourself in different people's shoes and imagine what is life like to maybe walk in their shoes or to be in this sort of area or environment or demographic. And of course, our biblical basis for doing so was the prophets. The prophets often speaking up for the voiceless in society and the marginalized or oppressed. So now that we've done that, we are starting something brand new that's going to build off of what we have already discerned and studied together. So we have a series of workshops and interviews, and they will be debuting the first Sunday of every month, and they will be online, accessible through our website to anybody, and they will cover a variety of topics which will help us dig in a little bit deeper into walking in other people's shoes. So real quick, I'll show you what's coming. Today, of course, is Starting Points, and so we are going to start us off on this journey by talking about a shared vocabulary and kind of what we need to know before setting off on this. But then, starting on the first Sunday in June, we will do a series of interviews called Growing Up Black in Denver, where we seek to put ourselves in the shoes of those from the Black and African American community who've grown up in this area and hear from their stories and the unique things that they have to share with us. The next month will be, what is it like right now to be Asian in America? The third month, we will be talking, since America is really a predominantly Christian nation, what's it like to be another faith? We will do a series of interviews with Jewish rabbis and Muslim imams and hear from their stories. Number 4, the fourth month, we'll talk with soldiers who have combat injuries, who have been veterans, and hear from them. What's it like to walk in their shoes? The 5th month, we will talk to immigrants and refugees and learn what it's like for them. You can see that each month, we are just seeking to hear stories. Either Pastor Dana or myself will be doing the interviews, and the scope of this project is to learn and to listen. So I hope you'll join us each month. Now, for starting points, where I start is I think about America, and I realize we are a melting pot, aren't we, right here in America, where we've got tons of different experiences and stories. Right here in our country, we are extremely unique in that. And from my perspective, how fun is it that we get to learn from all of them? But if we're going to learn, we need to have some terms that we all agree on. So, for example, here's a couple of terms that we need to come up with good definitions for, because you may hear them in these upcoming interviews. We'll start with the terms prejudice and racism. I know that you've heard both of those terms before, but do we all agree on what the definitions are for those terms? When I say prejudice, or when you say racism, do we know what the other person is talking about? Because if we don't, if we're on different pages, well, then it's not going to be very helpful to have a conversation or to imagine walking in other people's shoes. So that's where we need to start. And we're lucky that the PCUSA, the denomination that we are part of, they give us definitions. Yeah, and I was actually surprised at the definitions that they had. I learned quite a bit in preparing for this, and I wanted to share those definitions with you. So this is coming from the PCUSA, and this is their definition for prejudice. Prejudice is understood to be judgments made in the absence of due examination and consideration of facts. And these judgments are held even when contradicted by facts. In the absence of a factual basis, prejudices are driven primarily by emotional responses such as fear. So that is the PCUSA's definition of prejudice. And what I hope that you heard there is that prejudice primarily is making a judgment about someone else, which, if we're being honest, we probably do every day, but it's a judgment that's not based on facts. Much more likely, it's based on feeling. And so prejudice is often creating stereotypes about one type of person or one group of people, saying, well, they're all kind of like that. Well, that's not really based on fact, is it? No, because every one of us are unique individuals, unique children of God, but prejudice would kind of sum it all up saying, well, I feel like they're all kind of this way, so that's the stereotype. That's the prejudice that I'm going to operate under. Prejudice paints with a very broad brush. So here's some examples. You can be prejudiced against poor people. You could believe like, all poor people are like that because, I don't know, they're lazy or they just don't want to work. That's an example of prejudice. Or you could be prejudiced against millennials. You say, all millennials want to do is be on their smartphone all day and all night. Now, that's probably true for some millennials, but to paint all of them with a broad brush and to then stereotype all of them, that's where prejudice comes in, a belief that's based on feeling and not fact. We do this all the time in our political system. You can say, all Republicans care about are their own paychecks. All Democrats care about are free giveaways. Prejudice. You could say all guys are like this. All girls are like this. Yes, what this definition is hoping that we come to understand is that all of us have some prejudice within us. And the Christian's work is to start to identify what is that prejudice and how does it affect how I view other people, even subconsciously. That's the tough work, but that is the work that I believe God calls us to. Now notice, we've not even talked about racial prejudice, but that's a whole nother layer to this discussion. Okay, so when is prejudice just prejudice, and when is prejudice racism? Well, let's again turn to the PCUSA because they give a definition of racism. Racism, they say, is when prejudice is combined with power. Then it becomes racism. Power is the capacity to command, control, and dominate social reality for the purpose of achieving a desired outcome. So an easy way to remember this is that racism is prejudice plus power. Prejudice plus power. It's when I take my individual stereotypes and generalizations, but then I have the power to build a system that supports my prejudice on a large scale. That's when prejudice becomes racism. So those who control power and have the ability to transform prejudice into racism, they do so by establishing or maintaining institutions and structures that then embody their own or their group's biases. Yes, racism often has to do with systems and power. So if I own a restaurant and I don't allow a certain type of people or person to be served at my restaurant, that's when it would become racism, because I'm using my own power as a owner to influence the larger society. Now, racism is a term that is thrown out a lot, but we need to be careful in really distinguishing between my own personal prejudice and being aware of that and being willing to do the work of that, But then also to be able to look into the world and say, well, where also then is prejudice at play on a larger level that influences institutions or systems and becomes racism? And then how, as Christians, do we speak in to those systems as well? So that is those first two definitions that I want us as starting points to have an agreement on, because you'll probably hear them in some of these interviews. But another term, and the final one I want to talk about that's been thrown around as well, I'm sure you've heard about it, is systemic racism. So you've got prejudice, you've got racism, which is prejudice plus power, but when does it become systemic racism? Well, that is simply when the prejudice is no longer on an individual basis, but has infiltrated a system so much that even behind the scenes or subconsciously, it then affects how the system operates. I've got a handy graph that I want to show you. We'll get that up on the screen for you. It's called Levels on Which Racism Exists. And look at that bottom one for a second. The very bottom one is the internalized, and this is kind of where we talked about prejudice earlier, where it's those race-based beliefs and feelings within individuals. That's where everything starts, right? It starts with a person's heart. But it can then go to the next level, which is interpersonal. That's where bigotry or biases can be shown between individuals, either through the words that I speak to someone or someone speaks to me, or through my actions from one individual to another. That's an interpersonal interaction. But those are not the only interactions that exist in the world. The third one is institutional. So that's where a person's personal prejudices can turn into discriminatory policies and practices within a particular organization or institution. And then if you go even beyond that, even a little bit broader, you get systemic. And that's where there are ongoing racial inequalities that are maintained by simply the way society operates. Now, I know that there are some who dismiss this notion and say systemic racism, that doesn't exist. And partly I think that's done from a good place, because they think, well, I don't have those feelings in my heart. I don't see that out in the world, so how can that really be real? But what I want to encourage you is to walk in other people's shoes right now, and walk in the shoes of those who have told us repeatedly that systems do tend to favor one group of people over other groups of people. Because as Christians, we need to care about that, because we want to do the reforming work needed within our society to make sure that systems are widely accessible to promoting all of humanity. So let me give you just two examples. There are many, many more, but these are two examples of where you actually have systemic racism at play within our society. And again, we're not blaming anybody. I don't want you to hear systemic racism and then just tune out or even turn off. We're taking a learner's posture here. And so why don't we learn from others through these conversations? So here's one example. This is by the Business Insider report. The source is the Federal Reserve, their financial accounts that they make available. Household wealth of Black and white Americans. You can see from 1989 to 2019, it was household wealth largely stagnant for the majority of Black Americans, somewhere around $6 trillion. But then compare that to white Americans. Already in 1989, you had a pretty big gap of about $20 trillion in household wealth, but look at how far that gap has widened in those roughly, 30 years. This is to say that systems are at play here, that systems are not helping everybody in a level playing field, but there's something going on here that we need to figure out where not everyone is able to live that American dream in the same way that we all feel like we need or should be able to live. So this is one example. Let me give you one more. Here's the ratio of imprisonment rates of black males to white males by age. So you can see that probably the most startling statistic is that 18 to 19-year-old black males are 12.7 times more likely to be imprisoned than white males of the very same age. Almost 13 more times likely to be imprisoned. This is telling us, something's wrong here. That this disparity is too wide. And so what are the deeper issues that are causing these results? What systemic issues are at play that then we need to try to reform and to fix? If you look across that graph, all black men of all ages are 5.8 times more likely to be incarcerated than their white counterparts. Over their lifetime, almost 6 times more likely. That's to tell you, okay, there's some sort of systemic issue at play here. Again, we as Christians, we're not seeking to blame a different group of people for the problems that we see, but we are supposed to go into our world wide-eyed to say, where are the disparities? Where are the issues at play, not just in individual hearts, but on a larger societal level? And then where is God asking us to help reform those systems? These are some of the terms that we want to be aware of, the starting points, as we move into this series of interviews. So you've heard right now prejudice, racism, and systemic racism. And now Pastor Dana is going to share with you a couple of more terms.
A couple other terms for us to familiarize ourselves with as we seek to walk in others' shoes is a term, blind spots. Blind spots refers to how all human eyes have a blind spot. It's a small region of the retina that is devoid of light receptors, and it keeps us from seeing objects when they fall into that region of our eye. We use this term blind spot as a metaphor for psychological and social blind spots that show up in the form of hidden biases. These hidden biases can guide our behaviors without us even becoming aware of their role. They are areas where we might be insensitive to another person's situation or their life experience because we are just simply blind to what they have gone through or what they have faced. And I'll give you a personal example about this. I am a new mom. I had a daughter 3 months ago. I had no idea what it was like to be a new parent, to be a mom, until I stood in these shoes, until I went through that life experience personally. I had no idea the stress that it causes, the sleepless nights that happen. We still have not slept. I had no idea how much joy a child can bring you until I had my daughter. I was blind to that life experience that my parents went through. I was blind to what my girlfriends had experienced until I faced it myself. Now, how do we address blind spots? Because we simply cannot go through every life experience that a person has. So, therefore, we must look inward. In order to address our blind spots, we have to look inside. We have to examine. We have to repair our blind spots. And it's only in repairing our blind spots that we can hope to achieve progress and awareness. It's through looking inward at our blind spots that helps us to increase our empathy, our compassion for other people. We have to show up and attend workshops like this. We have to stop and examine. We have to listen to other people's stories That's what helps us to become aware of these blind spots. That's what helps us to be more empathetic people. And that brings me to another good term for us to familiarize ourselves with, the word empathy. Empathy versus sympathy. Now, these are two words that are very closely connected. It is very hard to differentiate between the two. Sympathy is the perception, the understanding and reaction to the distress or need of another person. Feelings of pity and sorrow for someone else's misfortune. To simplify that a little bit, we could understand sympathy as a feeling for an individual or a feeling for the experience that a person went through. An example of this is they had great sympathy for the flood victims. Now, empathy, on the other hand, is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. You can have empathy for someone without ever having experienced their grief or their situation. Empathy could be understood as feeling with the individual, feeling alongside of. An example of this, they could understand the range of emotions and loss experienced by the flood victims and how those emotions change over time. Brené Brown, she's a very well-known author. She has written a lot about empathy and sympathy, and she refers to empathy as a choice and a sacred space. A sacred space because you're choosing to identify with the emotions in yourself and then connect with the emotions that another person is experiencing. Empathy is connecting with people so they know we're not alone in their struggle. So hopefully these three terms helps to shed a little bit of light on how we can empathize and sympathize with other individuals and how we can seek to walk in someone else's shoes. Thank you so much for tuning in to this Starting Points workshop. David and I are both very thrilled about this series. I think every week is just going to be different and very unique. And so this week, as we've just kind of gone over some of these terms and these buzzwords, maybe we should kind of talk about why it's important to become aware of these terms, but also why are these terms buzzwords? Why are they creating divisiveness in our communities?
Yes. Yeah, I know we both wondered that as we were putting together this kind of Starting Points workshop, and we were talking about what are some of the main terms that we really should address. And these terms, blind spots, systemic racism, they all kind of just poured out as terms that not everyone agrees upon. And we asked ourselves, why? Like, why is that? Why are we fighting about these terms? And in my reflection, I just kind of think right now in the state of America, we fight about everything. And that's really what I've kind of come down to, is that we are just kind of a divided nation right now. And it's true in politics, it's true in faith communities and religion. And unfortunately, it's also true when talking about these sort of race relation issues, that they've continued to be divisive. And so I know our hope was to say, well, why don't then we all work from the same page? Let's talk about these terms. We hear them out in the world, we hear them on the news. What do they really mean? And then when we all agree on these terms, then how do we use them to actually help move the conversation forward? I think that was our goal.
Yeah, I love that, because even just hearing you define and describe racism as a prejudice that's combined with power, I think that just gives a broader understanding to a word that we can just throw around that has implied meaning. So now we have this shared language and this clarity. So now we can say, okay, let's move forward. And it changes our lens for how we hear other people's stories too.
I think it does, and I like that term, it changes the lens. Because I think sometimes we think like, oh, they're going to be talking about racism. I'm not a racist. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't have to watch that. But it's not really about that, is it?
Right.
It's about, there are larger issues at play that affect all of us. And so then how, as we as a church, do we work together? on really, as a united front, working through some of these issues.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point too, because as I talked about blind spots, it's these hidden biases. And I think that we can very easily say, oh, I'm not racist. But if you can examine every aspect of your hidden biases and then say you're not racist, that's a totally different statement.
It really is. And the statement's probably true, but then you can also follow it up with, but where am I showing prejudice? And that's where it becomes, I think, real for us to say, well, we all probably have some prejudice, and that we need to unearth and do some work on. And it's not pretty, it's not fun work, but as a Christian, I think it's the work that God calls us to.
Yeah.
Well, so I have a question for you then as well. Why, as a church, should we be talking about these sorts of topics? Because I know that, church in general kind of stays away from anything that could be divisive.
Right.
But we're deciding that, no, I think the place of the church is right here in this conversation. Why?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think as a church, we can kind of shy away from conflict or creating divisiveness instead of really just unearthing it and just kind of looking inward and not from a judgmental kind of way, but just saying we all have flaws and we all have work to do. And perhaps standing up here as pastors of a congregation and saying we have flaws too will allow other people to say, okay, well, we can admit that we have flaws as well, because we all don't have it perfectly and we don't have it all put together. I think that it's really important as Christians and as a church to look inward and to examine ourselves and to hear other people's stories and what their life experiences are, because it helps us to have compassion for them. It helps us to have empathy for their situation, which allows us to love other people authentically.
Yeah. Thinking about that, we so often on Sunday morning say that's the goal of a Christian, to share God's love. This is then part of how we do that. This is putting that sometimes abstract principle into practice to say, okay, we are going to show love through tackling these hard issues. I think of church as we're a team here. Like, we are a team, we're in this together. And so in other parts of society where you might have these conversations, either with a friend or on social media, these conversations can feel tough to have, where you're almost sniping at one another or just talking to those who agree with you and are nodding their heads. But as a church, we have each other's backs. We want to actively support one another. And so I really think this is a safe place, that we can have this sort of conversation where we can do it without feeling put on the spot, without attacking one another, and in then doing so, hopefully really get down to the meaningful conversations.
Yeah, I love that this is a safe space, because if we're a church family, that's what we should be providing, is this safe space where we can have difficult conversations and walk away with enlightenment and awareness.
Yeah, amen.
So what are some of your hopes for this series and these workshops?
Yeah, this is quite the undertaking, where we are doing quite a few in-depth interviews and really spending some good time thinking this out. I think because we both realize it's worth it.
Yeah.
Like, this is a conversation that's worth having. And so my hopes for this is that you become engaged in it, that you become involved in these conversations. It's very easy to simply sit on the sidelines and maybe watch this video and not do anything else with it. But my hope for you as one of your pastors is that you engage in the material, and we'll have a series of conversations that are led by either Pastor Dana or myself, and I hope that you get involved in those. We'll also have a series of homework. Sometimes, some months, it'll be reading a book. Sometimes it'll be watching a movie. I'm definitely going to do those months. But I hope that you get involved in the homework so that together, as a congregation, together, we can grow through these workshops. That's my hope. What are your hopes for this?
One of my hopes is just to really listen to some of these stories and these life experiences that other people have that we're pretty oblivious to. So I think it'll be very interesting to hear those firsthand accounts. Also, I think it will be just great for us as a church family to really just kind of look inside, to have these honest conversations with ourselves, and to grow from these experiences. I think we have a real opportunity to grow personally, and I think we have an opportunity to just increase compassion for other people as a whole.
Yeah, amen. Well, I'm glad that you have started with us on this first workshop, Starting Points. And in 2 weeks, the first interview will drop. And I look forward to going on this journey with you. Thanks, everyone.